Single tax is having to throw away half your groceries every week because you can't get through them all. Single tax is having no one to split your subscriptions with, your Amazon Prime, your Netflix, etc. Single tax is not having a second brain to help you, so you end up spending more. For example, you leave your clothes in the washer because no one's helping to remind you to put them in the dryer, or putting them in the dryer so you have to wash them a second time. Single tax is not having a second brain, so you have to pay more in your bills. For example, not having a second person checking to make sure the lights have been turned off before you leave your apartment when you go out of town.
Here's something I didn't know about till I started researching this. There's something called the single tax. It's not an official tax. It's just a financial reality of living alone versus living with a partner. Zillow did a study and found that single people pay an average of $7,110 more per year just for housing compared to someone splitting costs with a partner. In New York City, that premium is over $20,000 per year. That's not rent being higher. That's the same apartment costing you more because you're paying 100% instead of 50%. Then you look at actual taxes. The standard deduction for a single filer in 2025 is $15,000. For married couples filing jointly, it's $30,000. Single people don't get access to certain tax credits. They can't contribute to a spousal IRA. They can't double their gift tax exclusion. Health insurance is more expensive per person when you're single. Car insurance too. Married people often get lower rates. Even Costco works against you. Bulk buying makes sense when you have a family, right? But when you're single, half of that food goes bad before you can even eat it. I'm not saying this to argue that everyone should get married. No. I'm saying that when people talk about choosing to be single, we should acknowledge what that choice actually cost.
I'm going to start this conversation with a question that feels uncomfortable, precisely because it cuts close to the bone. What happens to a society when one half of it quietly withdraws its desire to participate? Not in protest, not in anger, but in calm resignation. Stay with me to the end of this video because what we are about to unpack is not a headline, not a trend piece, and not outrage bait, but a slow-moving shift that is already reshaping relationships, economics, culture, and the future itself. Before we go any further, make sure you like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell and select all if you want more Angry Guy content and want every single video the moment we release it. It is the simplest way to support the channel and make sure you do not miss what is coming next. Also, if you are serious about protecting yourself in uncertain times and learning how to safeguard and grow your assets, check out Angry's Crypto Academy. Inside the Academy, I break down how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly, how to think about risk, and how to position yourself for long-term stability rather than short-term hype. The Academy is linked in the description of this video, so go check it out now. And finally, if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It helps keep the lights on and the content flowing. And now let us talk about what is really happening. For decades, the public conversation around relationships between men and women has focused almost exclusively on what women want, what women fear, and what women are dissatisfied with. Entire academic fields, media industries, and policy frameworks have been built around that perspective. Meanwhile, men were told to listen, to adapt, to improve, and to change. And for a long time, many did exactly that. They worked harder, said less, internalized criticism, and tried to find their place in a shifting social landscape. But something changed quietly. Without marches or slogans, large numbers of men began to disengage. Not because they hate society, not because they want chaos, but because they no longer see a future that rewards their participation. Desire is not something you can legislate, shame, or threaten into existence. When desire fades, compliance might remain for a while, but enthusiasm disappears first. That is the phase we are in now. What we are witnessing is not men rebelling, it is men opting out. Men are increasingly questioning whether relationships, dating, and traditional social participation offer a return that justifies the cost. That cost is not only financial, though finances matter. It is emotional, reputational, legal, and psychological. Many men now look at the modern dating environment and see uncertainty without upside, risk without reward, and responsibility without appreciation. Faced with that equation, they choose the simplest option available. They walk away. This is often framed as bitterness or resentment, but that framing misses the point entirely. Most men who disengage are not angry. They are calm, they are focused, they are prioritizing peace, stability, and predictability. They are building lives that minimize exposure to conflict rather than maximize validation. This shift has consequences that extend far beyond dating apps or social media debates. Consider demographics. In the United States alone, projections suggest that by 2030, a large percentage of women between the ages of 25 and 44 will be single and without children. When you include single mothers, the number becomes even more significant. Similar patterns are visible across Europe and East Asia. These outcomes are often explained as women choosing independence, careers, or freedom. But that explanation only tells half the story. The other half is men choosing absence. In countries like South Korea, Japan, and increasingly China, birth rates are collapsing at historic levels. The common narrative blames economic pressure, housing costs, or women delaying marriage. Yet beneath those factors lies a deeper dynamic. Men are disengaging from the relationship market altogether. They are not competing, not courting, and not negotiating. They are redirecting their energy elsewhere. When men stop pursuing relationships, the structure of society begins to strain. Dating ecosystems collapse first, followed by marriage rates, followed by birth rates. Eventually, economic systems feel the pressure as well. Here's why. Men still contribute the majority of tax revenue in most developed countries. At the same time, women drive the majority of consumer spending. That balance only works when men are motivated to earn more and women are motivated to spend within family and relationship frameworks. Remove the incentive for men to build families, and you remove the incentive to maximize income. Men who live alone, who do not date, who do not plan for children, do not need large homes, luxury vehicles, or expensive lifestyles. They work just enough, save aggressively, and opt out of consumption driven status competition. Minimalism is not a trend for these men, it is a strategy. When enough men adopt this strategy, tax revenue declines, consumer spending contracts, and entire industries begin to wobble. Restaurants depend heavily on men paying for dates and family outings. Gyms depend heavily on male memberships. Bars and nightlife depend on men funding the environment. As men withdraw, these spaces hollow out. This is not theoretical. We are already seeing it. Men are building home gyms rather than attending public ones. They are cooking at home rather than dining out. They are socializing in private or digital spaces rather than public venues. They are spending less, working fewer hours, and prioritizing autonomy over advancement. At the same time, many women find themselves confused by the speed of this change. For years, the message directed at men was to step back, to give space, to listen more, and to defer. Men heard that message and took it seriously. Now, when they do exactly that, the absence is interpreted as abandonment rather than compliance. And this disconnect is at the heart of the current tension. Men are not lift straight locking women out through confrontation. They are doing it through indifference. They are not campaigning against women. They are simply building parallel lives that do not require female participation. Look online and you can see the infrastructure forming. Male focused media, male focused financial education, male focused fitness spaces, male focused communities. These are not reactionary spaces built on anger. They are practical spaces built on shared experience and mutual understanding. Even content creators who once focused exclusively on finance, gaming, or lifestyle topics increasingly address gender dynamics, not to inflame conflict, but to explain reality as their audiences experience it. Men want language for what they are living through, and they are finding it in these spaces. Another factor accelerating this shift is technology. Artificial intelligence is reshaping labor markets at a speed that few governments are prepared to handle. Men, particularly single men, are adapting quickly. They are experimenting with remote work, decentralized income, trading, crypto, and skill based exchanges. These systems reward autonomy and adaptability rather than credentials and compliance. Men thrive in environments where results matter more than optics. Women, by contrast, are often more exposed to consumer debt, lifestyle inflation, and institutional employment structures that are vulnerable to automation. As AI replaces jobs, the safety nets that many assumed would always exist are proving thinner than expected. This creates a stark divergence, and single men with low expenses and flexible income sources feel relatively insulated. Single women with higher expenses and fewer buffers feel increasing pressure. When pressure rises, expectations shift, and many women now express a desire for men to re engage, to commit, and to provide stability again. But desire cannot be negotiated retroactively. Men who have found peace in solitude are reluctant to give it up. They are not seeking validation, they are seeking predictability. Many have concluded that modern relationships do not offer that. This is where the conversation often becomes emotional, but it does not need to be. This is not about blame, it is about incentives. For decades, men were told that their traditional role was outdated, unnecessary, or problematic. They were encouraged to decenter themselves. Hard times are here. Jobs are disappearing fast. And if you lose yours, you could be homeless in a few months or even a few weeks. But it doesn't have to be that way. Check out Angry's Creator Academy and learn how to build your own online business using YouTube to grow it. And get the free creator blueprint when you sign up. The link's in description below. Go check it out now. They did. Now, society is discovering that when men decenter themselves, the systems built around their participation weaken. Governments cannot mandate attraction. Corporations cannot market desire back into existence. Cultural narratives cannot shame men into wanting what they no longer value. When men are not fighting for family, love, or a shared future, the only thing they will protect is their peace, and peace, once found, is fiercely guarded. You can see this in migration patterns as well. Some men choose to relocate, seeking environments where expectations align more closely with their values and where the cost of living allows them to live comfortably without excessive strain. Others remain but disengage locally, limiting interaction and exposure. The result is the same. Parallel ecosystems emerge. These ecosystems function, but they do not sustain the broader social contract that modern states rely on. Debt based economies assume continuous growth, consumption, and participation. When participation declines, the illusion of perpetual expansion cracks. This is why the current moment feels unstable. It is not driven by a single policy or movement. It is driven by millions of individual decisions made quietly, rationally, and without coordination. Men are not staging a revolt, they are declining to volunteer. None of this means cooperation is impossible in the future. It does mean that cooperation must once again offer value to all participants. If relationships are to recover, they must be built on mutual benefit rather than obligation. If society wants men to re engage, it must offer a vision of the future that respects their desire for stability, autonomy, and dignity. Ignoring this reality will not reverse it. At the end of the day, this conversation is not about conflict between men and women. It is about alignment between incentives and outcomes. When incentives disappear, participation follows. Men did not wake up one morning and decide to abandon relationships and society. They observed patterns, they adapted, They optimized. Men are by nature problem solvers. When a system consistently produces negative outcomes, they stop trying to fix the system and instead remove themselves from it. This is not ideological, it is practical. A man who repeatedly experiences loss, punishment, or instability in one arena will redirect his energy to another where effort produces reliable results. That is exactly what has happened with work, relationships, and social participation. Many men now treat dating the same way an investor treats a failing market. When the risk consistently outweighs the reward, capital is withdrawn. Emotional capital is no different from financial capital in this respect. It flows where it is respected and grows, and it leaves where it is depleted. This is why so many men have turned inward. Physical fitness, personal discipline, financial literacy, and self sufficiency have replaced romance and social validation as primary goals. These pursuits are measurable, they are predictable, they reward consistency rather than vulnerability. A man can lift weights, learn a skill, or grow an account without worrying that tomorrow the rules will change and he will be blamed for not anticipating it. The concept of peace is often misunderstood here. Peace does not mean loneliness or despair. For many men, peace means control over their environment and outcomes. It means waking up without anxiety, planning without fear of disruption, and living without the constant need to explain or defend oneself. Once a man experiences this level of peace, the idea of reintroducing chaos for uncertain emotional rewards becomes deeply unappealing. This is why appeals to guilt or duty no longer work. Telling men that society needs them, that women need them, or that the future depends on them rings hollow when their lived experience tells them they were never truly valued as individuals. Obligation without appreciation is not sustainable. Eventually, compliance turns into withdrawal. A crucial piece of this puzzle is how conflict has been framed. For years, men were told that any attempt to articulate their perspective was an attack, any boundary was control, and any dissatisfaction was entitlement. Over time, men learned that silence was safer than speech, distance was safer than engagement, solitude was safer than vulnerability. Silence, however, is not agreement, and distance is not defeat, it is simply exit. When men leave public conversations, the conversation does not become more accurate, it becomes incomplete. Policies are written without considering male incentives. Cultural narratives are shaped without male input. The result is a feedback loop where men feel even less represented, further accelerating disengagement. Look at education. Boys are falling behind at every level, from primary school through university. This is not because boys lack ability, it is because as the environment increasingly does not reward masculine traits like competitiveness, risk taking, and physicality. Instead of adjusting the system to accommodate different learning styles, society has largely chosen to pathologize boys. Many men remember this treatment from childhood, and it informs their adult decisions more than most realize. Look at family courts. Many men perceive these systems as adversarial rather than fair. Whether every perception is accurate is less important than the fact that the perception is widespread. When men believe that commitment carries disproportionate risk, they avoid commitment. Rational actors avoid asymmetric downside. Look at media. Male success is often framed as suspect, male ambition as selfish, and male authority as inherently abusive. Meanwhile, male failure is mocked or ignored. There is very little space left for men to exist as complex individuals. Faced with that environment, many men simply opt out of the narrative entirely, and the result is a growing class of men who are economically productive but socially invisible. They work enough to sustain themselves, invest quietly, and otherwise disengage from public life. They are not protesting, they are not voting with signs, they are voting with absence. This absence is beginning to show up in unexpected ways. Entire sectors built on discretionary spending are shrinking. Dating apps report declining male engagement, Nightlife districts struggle to stay open. Even travel patterns are shifting as men choose solo or purpose driven travel over social or romantic experiences. At the same time, women are being told contradictory stories. On one hand, they are told they are independent, empowered, and do not need men. On the other hand, they are increasingly told to worry about loneliness, declining birth rates, and economic insecurity. These messages collide, creating confusion and anxiety. When women look for men to stabilize that anxiety, they find fewer available and willing participants. This leads to a narrative reversal that feels abrupt but is actually overdue. Suddenly, men are being asked to return, to commit, to build, to provide, and to participate again. But this request often comes without acknowledgement of what drove them away in the first place. Without that acknowledgement, the request feels transactional rather than relational. Men sense this immediately. You cannot ask someone to re enter a system that punished them without first admitting the punishment existed. You cannot demand trust from someone whose trust was repeatedly violated. Trust, like desire, cannot be commanded. It must be rebuilt slowly, consistently, and honestly. Another layer to this conversation is globalization. Men are no longer confined to the social norms of their immediate environment. Technology has made the world smaller and comparisons easier. Men can see how relationships function in different cultures, how expectations vary, and how costs differ. This exposure has broken the illusion that the current model is the only option. Some men choose to relocate physically. Others simply adopt different values while staying put. Either way, the effect is the same. Local systems lose participants. Critics often frame this as escapism or avoidance, but that framing misses the agency involved. These men are not running away from responsibility. They are choosing which responsibilities to accept. They are willing to work, to build, and to contribute, but only on terms that do not require self erasure. This brings us to an uncomfortable truth. Modern society relies heavily on the assumption that men will continue to show up regardless of how they are treated. That assumption is proving false. When men stop showing up, the gap cannot be filled by rhetoric alone. Consider infrastructure, logistics, and maintenance. These are male dominated fields for a reason. They are physically demanding, high risk, and often thankless. When participation declines, systems degrade. This is not ideology, it is mechanics. The same applies to defense, energy, and emergency response. These functions require individuals willing to accept danger and responsibility. Historically, men accepted these roles in exchange for status, family, and social respect. When those incentives weaken, recruitment becomes difficult. This is why attempts to coerce participation through policy are unlikely to succeed. Mandates create compliance, not commitment. A man who feels coerced will do the bare minimum and nothing more. Societies do not thrive on bare minimum effort, they stagnate. The phrase hostages with smiles captures this dynamic perfectly. You can force attendance, but you cannot force enthusiasm. Without enthusiasm, innovation dies. Without innovation, decline accelerates. What we are witnessing then is not simply a gender issue, it is a civilizational issue. Systems built on participation collapse when participation becomes optional and undesirable. Men are demonstrating that participation is, in fact, optional. This realization terrifies institutions because it exposes a lack of leverage. Threats lose power when the threatened no longer care about the outcome. Shame loses power when the shamed disengage from the audience. Incentives lose power when they no longer align with values. The future will likely be defined by whether society can recalibrate those incentives honestly, not through slogans, not through blame, but through structural change. That means re examining legal frameworks, cultural narratives, and economic expectations. It means asking hard questions. What does commitment actually offer men today? What protections exist for those who invest their lives in others? What guarantees, if any, accompany sacrifice? Until those questions are answered credibly, disengagement will continue. Men are not seeking dominance, they are seeking fairness. They are not demanding control, they are demanding clarity. They want to know the rules, trust that the rules will not change mid game, and believe that effort will be rewarded rather than punished. For many men, the current environment fails those tests, so they leave. As this process unfolds, more people will notice the effects, more headlines will be written, more experts will debate causes and solutions, but none of that will matter unless it addresses the core issue of incentives and trust. The death of male desire is not about attraction, it is about purpose. When purpose is undermined, desire fades. When desire fades, participation ends. Men have found purpose in peace, self mastery, and independence. They are unlikely to abandon that lightly. This is not the end of the story, it is the middle. The next chapter depends on whether society is willing to confront uncomfortable truths rather than searching for convenient villains. These alternatives are not flashy. They do not seek validation from legacy media or academic approval. They are functional, resilient, and intentionally low profile. Men are creating lives that operate beneath the radar, precisely because visibility has become a liability rather than an asset. The less visible a man is, the fewer expectations are imposed on him, and the more freedom he retains to structure his life on his own terms. One of the most obvious expressions of this shift is how men relate to work. The old model was simple: work hard, climb the ladder, earn more, provide more, and receive status and respect in return. That model assumed a social contract that no longer exists. Today, advancement often comes with increased scrutiny, higher risk, and diminishing personal benefit. For many men, the rational response is not to opt out of work entirely, but to opt out of ambition as it was traditionally defined. Men are increasingly choosing jobs that pay enough rather than as much as possible. They are prioritizing flexibility over prestige. They are choosing trades, remote work, or self directed income streams that allow them to disengage from office politics and ideological pressure. This is not laziness, it is optimization. A man who needs less money needs less compliance. This has ripple effects across the economy. When men stop chasing promotions, corporate hierarchies stagnate. When men stop working overtime, productivity metrics soften. When men stop consuming at previous levels, growth projections miss their targets. None of this is catastrophic overnight, but it compounds over time. Another major development is how men are forming communities. Traditional social structures like churches, clubs, and civic organizations have declined, often due to politicization or loss of trust. In their place, men are forming smaller, tighter networks based on shared values and mutual benefit. These networks are not open access, they are selective by design. Trust is the currency here. Men who have felt betrayed by institutions are cautious about where they invest their loyalty. They vet carefully. They share resources selectively. They support one another quietly. This creates resilience that is difficult to disrupt because it does not depend on centralized leadership or public approval. Women, by contrast, are often encouraged to rely on large scale systems for support. Government programs, corporate benefits, and social platforms are positioned as safety nets. When these systems strain or fail, the impact is immediate and visible. Men in decentralized networks feel these shocks less acutely because their support structures are distributed and adaptive. This divergence becomes especially pronounced during periods of economic stress. Inflation, housing shortages, and job instability affect everyone, but they affect men and women differently based on lifestyle choices. A minimalist man with few dependencies can absorb shocks that overwhelm someone carrying high fixed costs. Over time, this gap widens. The conversation around dating often ignores this economic dimension. Many women still expect men to operate under an outdated provider model while simultaneously rejecting the social structures that once justified that model. Men notice this contradiction. They understand that expectations have remained high while incentives have declined. Faced with that imbalance, they disengage. It is important to emphasize that this disengagement is not driven by hatred or resentment. It is driven by arithmetic. Inputs no longer produce desired outputs. When that happens, rational actors change strategies. Technology accelerates this process. Digital tools allow men to meet their needs without social negotiation. Entertainment, education, fitness, and even companionship can now be accessed privately. This reduces the necessity of public interaction. When interaction becomes optional, it must compete with convenience and control. This is why efforts to shame men back into participation are ineffective. Shame only works when the individual values the opinion of the group doing the shaming. Men who have already disengaged do not. They are not seeking approval, they are seeking stability. There is also a generational component to this shift. Younger men are growing up watching older men navigate divorce, legal battles, and social isolation despite decades of effort and compliance. These observations shape behavior long before men enter the dating market themselves. Lessons are learned early, often silently. Young men are not rebelling against tradition. They are questioning whether tradition still functions as advertised. When the answer appears to be no, they decline to participate. This creates a feedback loop. As fewer men engage, women experience increased competition for a shrinking pool of participants. This competition often leads to frustration and anxiety, which then manifests as criticism of men rather than reflection on systemic misalignment. That criticism further discourages male engagement. The irony is that many of the behaviors now criticized in men were encouraged only a few decades ago. Independence, self focus, and emotional restraint were once considered virtues. Men are still embodying those traits, but the cultural context has shifted around them. When expectations change without acknowledgement, confusion follows. And another underdiscussed factor is risk tolerance. Men are generally more willing to accept physical and financial risk, but only when the potential reward justifies it. Modern relationships often present high risk with unclear reward. Legal exposure, reputational damage, and financial liability loom large, while emotional fulfillment is uncertain. For many men, this is a poor bet. As a result, men channel their risk tolerance into arenas where outcomes are clearer. Investing, entrepreneurship, physical challenges, and skill acquisition offer measurable progress. Success and failure are defined by effort and strategy rather than subjective interpretation. This clarity is deeply appealing. The implications for society are profound. When large numbers of men disengage from traditional pathways, institutions built around those pathways struggle to adapt. Education systems, housing markets, and even urban planning assume family formation and long term commitment. When those assumptions fail, inefficiencies multiply. Governments respond predictably. They attempt to incentivize participation through subsidies, campaigns, or moral appeals. But incentives cannot compensate for broken trust. Moral appeals cannot override lived experience. Without addressing root causes, these efforts fall flat. Some policymakers will inevitably attempt coercion, mandatory participation, increased taxation, or regulatory pressure may be used to extract compliance. These approaches may produce short term results, but they undermine long-term legitimacy. Men who feel coerced will disengage further, seeking loopholes, alternatives, or exit strategies. Exit does not always mean leaving a country. It can mean leaving the system psychologically. When people stop believing in the system, they stop investing in it emotionally. They comply minimally and disengage maximally. This is where the concept of the social contract becomes relevant. A contract only functions when both parties believe it is fair. For many men, the contract feels unbalanced. Responsibilities remain high, while benefits have eroded. Without renegotiation, the contract dissolves. Renegotiation requires honesty. It requires acknowledging that some policies and narratives have had unintended consequences. It requires listening to men without immediately framing their concerns as grievances or entitlement. That kind of dialogue is rare in the current climate. Instead, conversations often default to blame. Blame is easy. It absolves systems of responsibility and places the burden on individuals. But blame does not restore trust, it accelerates withdrawal. Meanwhile, life goes on. Men continue to adapt quietly. They invest in themselves. They build resilience. They form networks. They reduce exposure. They prioritize peace. The question is not whether this trend will continue. It will. The question is how societies respond. Will they attempt to force participation, risking further erosion of trust, or will they confront the misalignments honestly and restructure incentives accordingly? Will they recognize that men are not broken, but responding logically to their environment? There is still time to recalibrate, but recalibration requires humility. It requires admitting that some assumptions were wrong. It requires shifting from moralizing to problem solving. Men are not asking for dominance, they are asking for fairness. They are not seeking control over others, they are seeking control over their own lives. These are reasonable desires. If society can meet men where they are, rather than where it wishes they were, cooperation may yet be restored. If not, parallel systems will continue to grow, and the distance between participants and institutions will widen. This is not collapse in the dramatic sense, it is decay through disengagement, slow, quiet, and difficult to reverse. That is where the real work lies. For a long time, society assumed that male participation was automatic. Men would work, build, protect, and provide because that was simply what men did. The idea that men might choose not to was barely considered. Now, that choice is being exercised at scale, and the shock is reverberating through institutions that were never designed for voluntary male disengagement. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this shift is how little drama accompanies it. There are no mass protests, no unified demands, no centralized leadership. That is precisely why it is so difficult to address. You cannot negotiate with a movement that has no spokespeople and no list of demands. Men are not asking for concessions. They are making individual calculations and acting accordingly. This decentralization makes the trend resilient. There is no single point of failure. Even if one narrative loses traction, the underlying behavior remains unchanged. A man who has built a life around low dependency and high autonomy does not need validation from cultural approval to continue. His lifestyle is internally consistent. Consider how men now think about time. Time has become the most valued resource, surpassing money or status. Men are acutely aware that time invested in unstable systems is time lost. When relationships, workplaces, or social environments demand constant emotional labor without proportional return, men reallocate their time elsewhere. This reallocation is not spiteful, it is strategic. The modern environment often treats male time as expendable. Meetings that go nowhere, processes that change arbitrarily, and expectations that shift without warning all signal to men that their time is not respected. In response, men protect their time aggressively. They minimize exposure. They simplify routines. They cut out anything that does not clearly improve their quality of life. This mindset extends into social interaction. Men are no longer willing to navigate ambiguous expectations or unspoken rules. Ambiguity equals risk. Risk without reward is irrational. Therefore, interaction declines. Another element rarely discussed openly is how praise and recognition function. Historically, men were motivated by achievement and acknowledgement. Today, male achievement is often downplayed or reframed as problematic, while failure is treated as a moral flaw. This creates a no-win scenario. Succeed and be suspect, fail and be disposable. Faced with this, many men opt out of the game entirely. When men stop competing, metrics lose meaning. Rankings, titles, and accolades matter less when those who once chased them no longer care. This creates confusion among those who still believe the old incentives apply. They wonder why motivation has evaporated, not realizing that the reward structure itself has changed. Family formation is perhaps where this misalignment is most visible. The expectations placed on men remain largely traditional. Provide stability, absorb risk, offer protection, commit long term. Meanwhile, the guarantees that once accompanied those expectations have weakened or disappeared. Commitment is expected without security. Sacrifice is expected without reciprocity. Men notice this imbalance immediately. The result is a growing preference for arrangements that minimize exposure. Men choose to live alone or with trusted peers. They choose short-term commitments or none at all. They choose predictability over passion. These choices are framed by critics as avoidance, but they are better understood as risk management. Risk management is a rational response to uncertainty. When uncertainty becomes the norm rather than the exception, risk management becomes the dominant strategy. This has implications for how future generations will be shaped. Boys raised in an environment where male withdrawal is normalized will internalize different expectations from the start. They will not aspire to roles that seem unrewarding or dangerous. They will design their lives around autonomy rather than obligation. This generational shift will further entrench disengagement. It will not reverse on its own. Cultural memory matters. Once a behavior pattern proves effective, it is passed on. Women, meanwhile, face a different set of pressures. Many are encouraged to pursue independence while simultaneously being told to expect traditional support structures to remain available. When those structures weaken, frustration grows. This frustration is often directed outward rather than inward, which deepens the divide. What is missing from most public discussions is empathy in both directions. Empathy does not mean agreement, it means understanding why people act as they do. Without understanding male incentives, any attempt to re engage men will fail. Empathy also requires acknowledging trade offs. You cannot maximize independence while expecting guaranteed support. You cannot dismantle traditional roles while demanding their benefits. These contradictions must be resolved honestly. The economic consequences of unresolved contradictions are already emerging. Labor shortages in physically demanding fields persist despite rising wages. Recruitment campaigns struggle to attract candidates. Automation fills some gaps, but not all. Infrastructure maintenance lags. Emergency response systems strain. These are not abstract problems, they affect daily life. When roads deteriorate, power grids falter, or response times increase, the cost of disengagement becomes visible. Yet the connection is rarely made explicit. Instead, discussions focus on surface level symptoms: declining birth rates, loneliness, economic anxiety. These are real issues, but they are downstream effects. The upstream cause is loss of trust and misaligned incentives. Trust is fragile. Once broken, it cannot be restored through messaging alone. It requires consistent behavior over time. Men need to see that rules are stable, boundaries are respected, and contributions are valued. Without these signals, disengagement remains the safest option. There is also a psychological dimension that deserves attention. Many men report a sense of relief after disengaging. Stress decreases, mental clarity improves, health markers stabilize. This positive reinforcement makes re engagement less attractive. Why return to an environment that was associated with anxiety and conflict? This does not mean men are incapable of connection. It means they are selective. They reserve energy for environments that feel safe and reciprocal. When those environments are scarce, solitude becomes preferable. The rise of private hobbies and solo pursuits reflects this. Men invest in home projects, fitness, learning, and creative outlets that offer mastery without negotiation. These pursuits are satisfying because they respond directly to effort. In contrast, social systems often feel unresponsive. Effort does not guarantee outcome. Compliance does not ensure stability. This unpredictability erodes motivation. As parallel systems grow, mainstream institutions face a choice. They can attempt to compete by offering clearer value, or they can attempt to suppress alternatives. Suppression rarely works in the long term. Competition requires adaptation. Adaptation begins with listening, not performative listening, but genuine engagement with uncomfortable feedback. It requires resisting the urge to moralize or dismiss concerns. It requires acknowledging that some strategies have backfired. This is difficult because it challenges deeply held narratives. But without this step, disengagement will accelerate. Some argue that society does not need men to participate as they once did. They point to automation, social programs, and changing norms. This argument underestimates the complexity of systems built on voluntary cooperation. Technology can replace some functions, but not trust, initiative, or responsibility. When systems rely increasingly on compulsion rather than consent, efficiency declines. Innovation slows. Resilience weakens. History offers many examples of this pattern. The current moment is not unique, but it is instructive. It shows what happens when a group with options decides to exercise them. Men are demonstrating that they have options. That demonstration alone shifts the balance of power. Power, in this context, is not dominance over others, it is freedom from dependency. Men are reducing their dependence on systems that no longer serve them. This makes them harder to influence. Influence requires leverage. Leverage requires dependency. As dependency declines, influence fades. This is why attempts to shame or pressure men feel increasingly ineffective. The levers no longer connect. What remains is the possibility of genuine reform. Reform does not mean returning to the past. It means creating a future where participation makes sense again, where effort leads to reward, where risk is balanced by protection, where contribution is met with respect. That future is possible, but it requires honesty. It requires acknowledging that the current trajectory is unsustainable. It requires moving beyond blame toward problem solving. Men are not enemies of society. They are participants who have lost confidence in the system. Restoring that confidence is the challenge of our time. Because without it, disengagement will continue, quietly reshaping the world in ways that are difficult to reverse. The first pillar of recalibration is predictability. Men can tolerate difficulty, stress, and even sacrifice when the rules are clear and consistently enforced. What they cannot tolerate is arbitrariness. Systems that change standards retroactively, reinterpret behavior after the fact, or punish intent rather than outcome erode trust rapidly. If society wants men to re engage, it must create frameworks where expectations are explicit and stable. This applies most clearly to law. Legal ambiguity is poison to commitment. When men believe that outcomes depend more on interpretation than evidence, more on perception than facts, They withdraw from situations where they are legally exposed. This is not paranoia. It is risk assessment. Reforms that emphasize due process, symmetry, and clear standards would go further toward restoring trust than any cultural campaign ever could. And the second pillar is reciprocity. Men are willing to contribute when contribution is acknowledged and valued. Reciprocity does not mean praise for existing, it means proportional exchange. Effort should result in tangible benefit. Sacrifice should be met with security. Responsibility should be matched with authority. When these elements are misaligned, motivation collapses. Modern narratives often celebrate the male sacrifice while simultaneously undermining male authority and autonomy. This contradiction creates resentment even in men who would otherwise be cooperative. If responsibility remains, authority must return with it. Without authority, responsibility feels like exploitation. The third pillar is respect for boundaries. Men disengage when boundaries are treated as negotiable or suspect. The expectation that men should be endlessly available, endlessly adaptable, and endlessly resilient ignores the reality of human limits. Boundaries are not hostility, they are self preservation. Respecting boundaries means accepting no as an answer without moral judgment. It means recognizing that opting out is not an attack. When men feel free to say no without punishment, they are paradoxically more likely to say yes when it matters. Another critical area is economic alignment. Many men no longer see a reason to maximize income because increased earnings often bring increased exposure rather than increased quality of life. Progressive burdens, social expectations, and lifestyle inflation consume gains without delivering satisfaction. If society wants men to be economically ambitious, ambition must be rewarded with real autonomy and security, not additional obligation. This includes rethinking how work is structured. Flexibility, clear metrics, and limited ideological pressure matter more to many men than status or titles. Workplaces that prioritize output over optics will attract and retain male participation. Those that demand performative compliance will not. Education also requires serious reconsideration. Boys are not broken. Systems that fail to engage them are. Competitive environments, physical activity, and clear achievement markers are not relics. They are essential components of male development. When boys grow up feeling pathologized, they become men who disengage. Addressing this does not require disadvantaging anyone else. It requires acknowledging that different groups thrive under different conditions. Ignoring those differences in the name of uniformity produces worse outcomes for everyone. Family formation, if it is to recover, must be rebuilt on mutual assurance rather than assumption. Men need confidence that long-term commitment will not expose them to asymmetric risk. This means transparent legal frameworks, fair dispute resolution, and cultural norms that value cooperation over leverage. Trust grows when systems demonstrate reliability over time. There are no shortcuts here. Trust cannot be demanded, it must be earned through consistent behavior. Another area often overlooked is narrative. Stories shape expectations. For years, dominant narratives have portrayed men primarily as problems to be managed rather than contributors to be valued. Even when unintended, this framing accumulates psychological weight. Men internalize it and adjust behavior accordingly. Changing narrative does not mean returning to idealized pasts. It means telling more honest stories about cooperation, shared responsibility, and mutual dependence. It means acknowledging that societies function best when all participants feel invested and respected. Media plays a role here, but so do everyday interactions. Small signals matter. How men are spoken to, about, and around influences whether they feel welcome or tolerated. Toleration is not enough to sustain engagement. Technology will continue to shape these dynamics. Artificial intelligence, automation, and digital platforms will reduce the necessity of traditional participation while increasing the importance of self-direction. Men who master these tools will further detach from systems that do not adapt. This makes reform time sensitive. The longer misalignment persists, the more entrenched alternatives become. Once men have built lives that function without mainstream systems, incentives to return diminish sharply. It is also important to recognize that not all men will re-engage, even if reforms occur. Some have crossed a threshold where solitude and independence are deeply preferred. That is not a failure, it is an outcome. Societies must adapt to the reality that participation will be more selective in the future. The goal, then, is not universal re-engagement. It is sufficient re-engagement to sustain cooperative systems. That requires making participation attractive rather than obligatory. At the same time, women face a necessary recalibration of their own expectations. Independence and interdependence cannot be maximized simultaneously without trade-offs. Acknowledging those trade-offs honestly allows for more realistic planning and less resentment. And this does not mean women must abandon independence. It means recognizing that independence shifts the structure of relationships and support. Adjusting expectations accordingly is not defeat, it is maturity. Ultimately, the future will belong to systems that respect choice. Coercion breeds resistance. Respect breeds cooperation. Men are demonstrating through action rather than rhetoric what they value. Peace, clarity, fairness, and autonomy are at the top of that list. Ignoring these values will not make them disappear. Designing systems that incorporate them may be the only path forward. What we are living through is not a crisis of masculinity, it is a crisis of trust. Trust between individuals, trust between citizens and institutions, trust between effort and outcome. Repairing trust is difficult, slow, and unglamorous, but it is possible. The alternative is continued fragmentation. Parallel systems will expand, shared spaces will shrink, common purpose will erode. Life will go on, but cooperation will become rarer and more fragile. Men have already adapted to that possibility. The question is whether society as a whole will. In such a landscape, relationships do not disappear, but they become rarer and more deliberate. Men who choose connection do so with a high threshold for trust and a low tolerance for instability. They are not swept along by momentum or expectation. They move slowly, evaluate carefully, and withdraw quickly when warning signs appear. This makes relationships harder to form, but potentially stronger when they do form. Scarcity replaces abundance and intention replaces impulse. Economically, selective participation reshapes priorities. Growth, driven by consumption, gives way to sustainability, driven by restraint. Industries that rely on excess struggle, while those that support autonomy, efficiency, and self-sufficiency thrive. Repair replaces replacement. Skills replace credentials. Ownership replaces access. This shift does not eliminate inequality, but it changes its shape. Those who can adapt gain leverage. Those who cannot feel left behind. Communities also evolve. Large, impersonal institutions lose influence, while small, trust-based networks gain it. These networks are not ideological by default. They are practical. They exist to solve problems, share resources, and reduce vulnerability. Membership is based on contribution and reliability rather than identity or rhetoric. In these spaces, reputation matters more than opinion. This environment rewards consistency. People who show up, follow through, and respect boundaries become valuable. Those who rely on performance or moral positioning struggle to gain traction. Over time, this creates a culture that values quiet competence over loud assertion. For men, this world feels familiar. It aligns with instincts towards self reliance and measured cooperation. For women, it requires adjustment, and social leverage rooted in visibility or narrative carries less weight in decentralized systems. Practical contribution and mutual benefit become the primary currencies. This does not diminish women, it simply changes the terrain. The tension many feel today comes from living between two worlds. The old world promised security through participation. The new world offers autonomy through choice. Transition periods are always uncomfortable. Expectations lag behind reality. Stories persist after conditions change. People argue about what should be while adapting to what is. One of the most significant changes in a world of selective participation is how responsibility is understood. Responsibility is no longer imposed by role or tradition. It is accepted voluntarily in exchange for benefit. This makes responsibility more meaningful, but also more limited. People are careful about what they commit to because commitment carries weight. And this shift has profound implications for governance. States built on broad participation must adapt to narrower engagement. Policy tools that rely on compliance lose effectiveness. Incentives matter more than mandates. Transparency matters more than authority. Trust becomes a strategic asset rather than a moral assumption. In this context, attempts to revive participation through nostalgia or fear are ineffective. People do not return to systems that failed them simply because alternatives are uncomfortable. They return when systems demonstrate change. Demonstrating change requires more than language, it requires structural signals, clear rules, fair processes, respect for autonomy, consistent enforcement, and these signals must persist over time to overcome skepticism. One gesture is not enough. Patterns matter. For men, the decision to re engage is not emotional, it is calculated. Does this environment respect my time? Does it protect my investment? Does it reward effort fairly? Does it allow me to exit without punishment if conditions change? If the answer to these questions is no, disengagement remains rational. It is important to understand that disengagement is not nihilism. Men who withdraw from certain systems often become highly engaged in others. They mentor quietly, they build quietly, they contribute selectively. Their impact is less visible, but not less real. This invisibility creates a distorted picture. Observers mistake absence from public spaces for absence from life. In reality, many men are living full, structured, and purposeful lives outside traditional frameworks. They are simply no longer broadcasting participation as proof of value. The psychological effect of this shift cannot be overstated. When men stop seeking validation from systems that devalue them, their sense of self stabilizes, anxiety decreases, focus improves, decision making becomes clearer. This internal stability is powerful reinforcement. It makes regression unlikely. Women, on the other hand, often experience increased pressure in this environment. Social scripts that once guaranteed attention and support lose reliability. Competition increases. Outcomes become less predictable. This can be disorienting. The temptation is to demand restoration rather than adaptation, but demand without leverage is ineffective. Adaptation requires realism. It requires recognizing that bargaining power has shifted. It requires building value within the new system rather than appealing to the old one. This is not a moral judgment, it is a strategic observation. The same applies to institutions. Those that adapt to selective participation will survive. Those that insist on entitlement to engagement will decay. History is clear on this point. Systems that cannot attract voluntary cooperation eventually rely on force, and force is expensive and brittle. What emerges instead is a patchwork society. Different communities operate under different norms. Some emphasize tradition, others emphasize innovation. Some prioritize autonomy, others prioritize cohesion. People choose where to invest based on alignment rather than obligation. This fragmentation is often described as dangerous, but it also contains opportunity. Smaller systems are more adaptable. They can experiment, they can fail without catastrophic consequences, they can learn quickly. In contrast, large centralized systems struggle to change direction. The challenge is coordination. Fragmented systems require new ways of cooperating across boundaries. This cooperation must be negotiated rather than assumed. It must be based on mutual interest rather than shared identity. This is more difficult, but it is also more honest. In relationships, this honesty manifests as explicit expectations. Ambiguity fades. People state what they want, what they offer, and what they will not accept. This reduces romance but increases clarity. Those who value clarity find this environment refreshing. Those who rely on ambiguity find it harsh. There is no universal preference here. The world does not need everyone to choose the same path. It needs systems flexible enough to accommodate difference without collapse. That is the real lesson of selective participation. Uniformity is fragile. Diversity of strategy is resilient. Men are demonstrating this through action. They are diversifying their engagement. They are hedging against uncertainty. They are refusing to concentrate risk in a single system. This behavior mirrors sound financial strategy. Do not put all resources in one asset. Do not rely on one counterparty. Maintain optionality. Men are applying this logic to life. Optionality is power. It allows choice. It reduces fear. It enables negotiation. When men regain optionality, they regain leverage. That leverage does not need to be exercised aggressively. Its existence is enough to change dynamics. This is why the current moment feels tense. Leverage is shifting. Those who once assumed guaranteed participation now face uncertainty. Uncertainty produces anxiety. Anxiety produces reaction. Reaction often takes the form of blame. But blame does not restore leverage, it accelerates loss. The path forward requires a different mindset. Instead of asking how to force participation, the question becomes how to earn it. Instead of assuming loyalty, systems must cultivate it. Instead of demanding sacrifice, they must offer security. This applies at every level: personal relationships, workplaces, communities, governments. Trust is rebuilt locally before it scales. It begins with consistent behavior in small interactions. Over time, patterns emerge. Confidence grows. Men are watching closely. They are not cynical by nature. They are cautious by experience. Show them that effort leads to fair outcome, and many will respond. Fail to do so, and they will continue to disengage quietly. The world shaped by selective participation is not doomed. It is simply different. It rewards honesty over performance, competence over compliance, peace over approval. Those who understand this will adapt. Those who resist it will struggle. At its core, this entire discussion comes down to one principle. Participation is no longer guaranteed. It must be chosen. Men have already made that choice in many areas of life. They chose peace. They chose clarity. They chose autonomy. They did not do so to punish anyone. They did so to survive and to live well. If society wishes to walk with them again, it must meet them where they are, not where it wishes they were. That is the reality of the moment. And now the conversation returns to you. What do you think about everything we covered? Do you see these patterns around you? Do you think recalibration is possible, or are parallel paths the future? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. Like the video if you like it. Do not forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Whether you're on top of the world or down in the dumps, whether your trading is going great or is a buzz, one thing's by your side, always through it all, lighting up smiles around the world for all. Nothing says you care like crypto. nothing can compare. Nothing, nothing, nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.